Sometime in the early 1920s, the exact date is not recorded with precision in the surviving sources, a young black man was locked inside a cell in one of New York State's prisons. The cell was small. There was no window, or if there was one, it offered nothing worth seeing. The walls were close. The light, if it came at all, came from a bare fixture or from a narrow slot in a heavy door. There was no conversation. There was no company. There was a cot, a bucket, and silence. The man's name was Ellsworth Raymond Johnson. He was in his early 20s. He was serving a 10-year sentence for burglary. He had been placed in solitary confinement not because of the original crime, but because of what happened after he arrived. He fought with other inmates. He fought with guards. He refused to defer, refused to comply. He refused to make himself smaller than he already was. His temperament, which had made him dangerous on the streets of Harlem, made him ungovernable inside a prison. The authorities responded the only way they knew how. They removed him from the population and placed him in isolation. He would spend more than 3 years of his sentence this way. Multiple sources confirm this figure. The Black Past biography of Johnson states that his constant clashes with inmates and guards resulted in spending more than 3 years of the 10-year sentence in solitary confinement. The Crime Library's account of Harlem gangs notes that he spent 1/3 of that sentence in isolation. Because of his attitude, he was shuttled from prison to prison, a practice common in the New York State penal system at the time, where incorrigible inmates were transferred repeatedly in an attempt to break their resistance. The transfers did not break him. The isolation did not break him either, but it changed him. That much is clear from everything that happened afterward. To understand what solitary confinement meant in the 1920s, it is necessary to abandon any modern assumptions about oversight, regulation, or reform. There were no federal guidelines governing the practice. There was no United Nations standard minimum rules for the treatment of prisoners. Those would not be adopted until 1955, and the Nelson Mandela rules designating prolonged solitary confinement as torture would not come until 2015. In the New York State prison system of the 1920s, solitary confinement was used routinely as punishment for insubordination, fighting, and defiance of authority. Inmates placed in isolation received minimal food, often bread and water, for extended periods. They had no access to other prisoners. Exercise, if permitted at all, was brief and irregular. Reading material was sometimes allowed and sometimes confiscated, depending on the institution and the discretion of individual guards. The cells were dark, cold in winter, and stifling in summer. A man could be placed in such a cell for weeks, months, or, as in Johnson's case, years at a stretch, with only brief interruptions before being returned to isolation following the next infraction. Ellsworth Johnson entered that system as a young man with a reputation for violence and a complete absence of strategic thought. He was, by every available account, a creature of impulse. Helen Lawrenson, an editor at Vanity Fair who later wrote about him, observed that he never learned to curb his temper or to bow his head to any man. His biography on Black Past notes that by his 30th birthday he had spent almost half his life in prison. He had been a pimp, a burglar, a stick-up man, a bodyguard for illegal gamblers. He carried a knife and a gun. He used both without hesitation. He was known for barroom clashes over the slightest provocation. He was small in stature, not physically imposing, but he compensated with a ferocity that made larger men think twice. He was, in short, exactly the kind of man that the prison system was designed to contain and, if possible, to destroy. That he was also black, Southern-born, and without resources or connections of any kind made his destruction seem all but inevitable. But something happened in those cells. Multiple sources describe the same transformation, and they describe it consistently enough that it can be taken as historical fact rather than legend. During his years of incarceration, Bumpy Johnson became an avid reader. He read constantly. He read poetry, philosophy, history. He did not simply read for distraction, he read with purpose and depth. He began writing poetry himself, and according to the historical record, some of his poems were published during the Harlem Renaissance, a remarkable achievement for a man writing from inside a prison cell, in an era when the literary culture of Black America was producing some of its greatest work. He was nicknamed the Professor by fellow inmates who noticed his reading habits. He became a skilled chess player. He studied the mechanics of argument and persuasion. He observed, from within the system, how power operated, how guards maintained control not through physical superiority alone, but through the manipulation of privileges, the control of information, and the strategic deployment of punishment. He learned, in the most brutal classroom available, the difference between strength and power. This distinction is essential to everything that followed. Strength is personal. It belongs to the individual body, the individual will. It can be overwhelmed by numbers, by weapons, by institutional force. Power is structural. It operates through networks, alliances, information, and the systematic application of pressure at points of vulnerability. Ellsworth Johnson entered prison possessing nothing but strength. He emerged possessing the beginnings of an understanding of power. At the solitary cell did not teach him to be patient. What it taught him was that impatience was a form of blindness, that a man who could not sit still long enough to read, to think, to observe the patterns in the behavior of those who controlled him, was a man who would always be controlled. This was not a sudden revelation, it was the slow accumulation of 3 years of enforced stillness pressed into his mind by the weight of silence and the absence of any distraction from his own thoughts. He was released in 1932. He was approximately 27 years old, though some sources place his birth in 1905, which would make him 26 or 27 at the time. He was broke. He was unemployed. He had no legitimate prospects. He had spent a decade rotating through the criminal justice system, and his record ensured that no employer of any consequence would consider him. He returned to Harlem, the same neighborhood he had left as a teenager, the same streets he had walked as a young thief and enforcer. But Harlem in 1932 was a different place than the Harlem he had left. The Great Depression had devastated the neighborhood. Jobs that had been scarce for black workers before the crash were now virtually non-existent. The cultural electricity of the Harlem Renaissance had dimmed. The numbers game, the illegal lottery that served as Harlem's primary economic engine, was more important than ever, because for many residents it represented the only remaining hope of financial advancement. And the numbers game was under attack. To understand what Bumpy Johnson walked into and what he chose to do about it, It requires understanding the numbers racket and the forces that were converging on it. The numbers game was simple in concept. A player chose a three-digit number and placed a small bet, sometimes as little as a penny. The winning number was determined by a published financial figure, often the daily clearinghouse totals from banks or the payout totals from horse racing. If your number matched, you won at substantial odds. For the bankers who organized the game, the people who collected the bets, employed the runners, and paid out the winnings, the margins were extraordinary. By the late 1920s, numbers banking was the largest black-owned business enterprise in America. It employed thousands of people directly and supported an entire secondary economy of restaurants, bars, clothing stores, and entertainment venues that depended on the cash it circulated through the community. The most powerful numbers banker in Harlem was a woman named Stephanie St. Clair. She was born in the French Caribbean, either Guadeloupe or Martinique, depending on the source, and had arrived in New York around 1912. By the early 1920s, she had invested her own capital into a numbers bank and built it into an empire. She earned an estimated $200,000 a year. She employed more than 40 runners and 10 comptrollers. She was known throughout Harlem as Madam Queen or Queenie. She was fiercely intelligent, deeply territorial, multilingual, fashionable, profane, and absolutely unafraid of anyone. She had also, through years of careful cultivation, and built something that most criminal operators in her position had not: a genuine relationship with the community. She took out advertisements in the Amsterdam News and other black newspapers, educating Harlem residents about their civil rights. She advocated for voting rights. She called out police brutality in public print. She was not merely a businesswoman operating in the shadows. She was a public figure who used her wealth and her platform to fight for the people who worked for her and lived around her. When Bumpy Johnson emerged from prison in 1932, St. Clair recognized something in him. Multiple sources describe this moment similarly. She saw a young man who was fearless, who was intelligent, and who had been refined, however roughly, by his years of reading and isolation. That he was no longer the impulsive street fighter who had gone into prison. He was still dangerous, still capable of violence, but there was a deliberateness to him now that had not been there before. St. Clair offered him a position in her organization. He accepted. He became her chief enforcer, her bodyguard, her principal lieutenant. Whether the relationship was also romantic has been the subject of speculation for decades. St. Clair was approximately 20 years his senior. The historical record does not resolve this question definitively, and it is not essential to the story that follows. What matters is that she trusted him, and he learned from her. If solitary confinement had taught Bumpy Johnson to think, Stephanie St. Clair taught him what to think about. The education was practical and immediate, or because the crisis facing Harlem's numbers operators was existential. The end of Prohibition in 1933 had destroyed the bootlegging profits that sustained the white mob's empires. Italian and Jewish crime families that had grown rich on illegal alcohol needed new revenue streams. They looked uptown, to Harlem, and they saw the numbers game, a multi-million-dollar enterprise run by black operators who had no political protection, no police allies, and no institutional support. Dutch Schultz, a Bronx-based mobster of legendary violence and instability, was the first to move in. His method was direct. He offered every black numbers banker in Harlem two options: hand over your business or pay him a large percentage of your profits. If you refused either option, you would be beaten, kidnapped, or killed. But the violence was only one dimension of Schultz's assault. The more devastating weapon was the system behind him. Schultz had police officers on his payroll throughout Harlem. He had politicians in Tammany Hall, the Democratic political machine that controlled New York City government, who ensured that his operations would be protected while his competitors' operations would be raided. He had corrupt judges who would convict his enemies on fabricated charges and release his associates with impunity. The numbers bankers who resisted Schultz were not merely fighting a gangster. They were fighting a machine that encompassed the police department, the courts, and City Hall. And this is the realization that the narrative structure demands we identify. The moment when the protagonist shifts from seeing a personal enemy to understanding a systemic problem. For Bumpy Johnson, that realization did not arrive in a single dramatic instant. It arrived through the daily education he received at St. Clair's side, watching as corrupt officers arrested her runners even after she had paid for their protection, watching as Tammany-connected politicians shielded Schultz's operations from prosecution, watching as the entire apparatus of city government functioned as an extension of the mob's will. St. Clair had understood this before Johnson arrived. She had been fighting the system, not just the gangster, for years. Her strategy was multi-layered and, for a woman operating outside the law in the 1920s and 1930s, remarkably sophisticated. She used the press. She placed advertisements in the Amsterdam News accusing senior police officers of corruption by name. She detailed the bribes she had paid. She published columns informing black residents of their legal rights, particularly their rights during police encounters. She organized the remaining independent black numbers bankers and launched what amounted to a Buy Black campaign, urging Harlem residents to place their bets only with black-owned operations rather than with the white-controlled operations that Schultz was installing. She physically confronted Schultz's storefronts, walking into the white-owned businesses that served as his betting drops, smashing their glass cases, destroying the policy slips, and ordering them out of her territory. Bumpy Johnson accompanied her on these operations, providing the physical force that backed up her fury. The police, predictably, responded not to St. Clair's accusations of corruption, but to her defiance. They arrested her on charges she described as fabricated. She was convicted of possession of policy slips and sentenced to 8 months at a workhouse on Welfare Island. The conviction was, in all likelihood, exactly what it appeared to be: retaliation by corrupt officers who were furious that a black woman had publicly accused them of taking bribes. But the imprisonment, which was intended to silence her, produced the opposite effect. When St. Clair emerged from the workhouse in 1931, she was not broken, she was vengeful, and she had a plan. In December 1930, while St. Clair was still incarcerated or shortly after her release, the exact chronology varies slightly between sources, she appeared before the Seabury Commission. The commission, formerly known as the Hofstadter Committee, had been established by the New York State Legislature at the direction of Governor Franklin D. Roosevelt to investigate corruption in New York City's magistrate courts and police department. It was chaired by State Senator Samuel Hofstadter and led by Samuel Seabury, a former judge and a relentless anti-corruption crusader who had spent his career opposing Tammany Hall's stranglehold on city government. The commission heard testimony from more than 1,000 witnesses, judges, lawyers, police officers, ordinary citizens, and defendants who had been victimized by the system. It was the most comprehensive investigation of municipal corruption in New York City's history. Stephanie St. Clair's testimony was extraordinary. She told the commission that she had controlled a numbers bank from 1923 to 1928. She detailed the bribes she had paid to members of the New York Police Department, totaling approximately $6,000 to $7,000, a significant sum in that era. She named specific officers. She identified a lieutenant of the 6th Division who had received payments of $100 and $500 delivered by an intermediary known as Mustache Jones. She described how she had paid plainclothes officers a total of $6,000 for protection of her employees, and how those same officers had continued to arrest and harass her runners despite the payments. Helen Lawrenson, in her memoir, Strangers at the Party, would later confirm that St. Clair's testimony went beyond the police. Lawrenson wrote that St. Clair accused a district attorney, 2 judges, and scores of police, bondsmen, and political fixers, providing names, dates, and the amounts paid in graft. The consequences were immediate and measurable. From St. Clair's testimony alone, a lieutenant and 13 police officers were suspended from the New York Police Department. Some sources describe the number as more than a dozen. One source, drawing on Lawrenson's account, places the total at more than 30 officers fired or suspended as a result of St. Clair's detailed testimony. The Commission's broader investigation, of which St. Clair's testimony was one component among many, produced consequences that shook the entire city government to its foundation. The Appellate Division of the New York Supreme Court ordered the dismissal of corrupt judges. Multiple magistrates resigned rather than face public examination. New York County Sheriff Thomas M. Farley was removed from office by Governor Roosevelt after he could not explain how he had accumulated wealth far exceeding his salary. He attributed it to a wonderful tin box, a phrase that became a symbol of municipal corruption. And in the investigation's most consequential outcome, Mayor James J. Walker, the flamboyant Tammany Hall loyalist who had accepted an estimated $1 million in bribes during his tenure, resigned from office in September 1932 rather than face removal by the governor. And the fall of Walker led directly to the election of Fiorello LaGuardia, the reform-minded Republican who would transform New York City government and preside over a massive reduction in Tammany Hall's influence. During LaGuardia's first term, Tammany's organizational membership dropped by 70%. The political machine that had protected Dutch Schultz, that had shielded corrupt police officers, that had ensured the systematic exploitation of Black Harlem's economic life, that machine was mortally wounded. And one of the threads that helped unravel it was the testimony of a black woman numbers banker from Harlem who walked into the Seabury Commission and told the truth about who she had paid and what they had done. Now, where was Bumpy Johnson in all of this? This is where intellectual honesty requires careful language. The historical record does not show Bumpy Johnson sitting before the Seabury Commission. He did not testify. He was not a witness. There is no document that places him in the room when St. Clair gave her testimony. His name does not appear in the Commission's published records. What the record does show is that by 1932, Johnson was St. Clair's most trusted lieutenant, her chief enforcer, and, according to some accounts, her closest confidant. He was the man who accompanied her when she confronted Schultz's operations. He was the man who protected her physically during a period when Schultz had placed a contract on her life. He was part of the organization that her testimony was designed to protect. To claim that Bumpy Johnson personally devised the strategy of testifying before the Seabury Commission would be to invent a fact. And to claim that he was uninvolved in the strategic calculations of St. Clair's organization during this period would be equally unsupported. The truth, as best as the historical record allows us to reconstruct it, is somewhere in the space between those two claims. What can be said with confidence is this: the man who emerged from solitary confinement in 1932 was not the man who had gone in. The years of isolation, reading, and self-education had produced a person capable of operating at a level of strategic sophistication that the young burglar and barroom brawler could never have achieved. When he joined St. Clair's organization, he brought to it not just physical courage, but an understanding of systems, how they functioned, where they were vulnerable, and how pressure applied at one point could produce effects at another. But whether he contributed directly to the decision to testify before the Seabury Commission, or whether he supported the strategy in other ways, or whether his role was purely as St. Clair's enforcer during a period when her life was under constant threat, these questions cannot be answered definitively. But the arc from the solitary cell to the fall of corrupt officials is not a fabrication. It is a trajectory. The cell produced the man joined the woman's testimony helped bring down a system, and the man, having watched and learned, would go on to build something of his own from the wreckage, because the story did not end with the Seabury Commission. Schultz survived St. Clair's legal assault. Though his political protections were severely weakened, he continued his violent takeover of Harlem's numbers rackets, and by the mid-1930s, St. Clair's resources were exhausted. She had spent, by her own account, $750,000 and endured more than 800 days in jail. She was forced into hiding after Schultz placed a contract on her life. She later described hiding in a cellar while a sympathetic building superintendent covered her with coal to conceal her from his killers. The war, by conventional measures, was lost. Almost every independent black numbers banker had submitted to Schultz or been destroyed. But Bumpy Johnson, the man who had learned patience in a solitary cell, was watching. He was watching Schultz overextend himself. He was watching the legal and political pressures mount as Thomas Dewey, appointed as special prosecutor by LaGuardia's reform government, the same government that existed because the Seabury Commission had brought down Walker, began targeting Schultz's operations. He was watching Lucky Luciano, the most powerful figure in the Italian mafia, grow increasingly wary of Schultz's instability. When Schultz, cornered by Dewey's prosecution, proposed assassinating the special prosecutor, Johnson watched Luciano refuse. When Luciano instead ordered Schultz's assassination, carried out on October 23, 1935, at the Palace Chop House in Newark, New Jersey, Johnson was ready to move. What happened next was the fulfillment of everything the solitary cell had prepared him for. With Schultz dead and St. Clair exhausted, Johnson did not attempt to wage another war. He did not try to drive the Italian mob out of Harlem through force. Instead, he negotiated. He went directly to Luciano's organization and proposed an arrangement that had no precedent in the history of organized crime in New York. Bumpy Johnson would control all of Harlem's numbers operations as an independent operator. He would manage the day-to-day business, hire his own people, set his own policies, and enforce his own rules. In exchange, a percentage of the profits would flow to what would become the Genovese crime family. Harlem would operate as a semi-autonomous territory, not absorbed into the Italian mafia's structure, but allied with it under terms negotiated by a black man from a position of strategic leverage. The leverage was real, and it was the product of intelligence rather than force. Johnson understood that Luciano needed stability in Harlem. The war with Schultz had been bad for business. The Seabury Commission had brought unwanted attention to the connections between organized crime and city government. Dewey's prosecution was closing in. Luciano needed someone who could manage Harlem quietly, without the violence and chaos that had characterized Schultz's tenure. Johnson offered exactly that: local knowledge, community relationships, and the discipline to run an operation without attracting the kind of attention that destroyed empires. The deal was struck, and for the next 3 decades, until his death in 1968, Bumpy Johnson governed Harlem's underground economy with an authority that no one, not the Italian mafia, not the police, not the federal government, was fully able to dislodge. Stephanie St. Clair, who had made the deal possible through her years of resistance and her courageous testimony, felt deeply betrayed by Johnson's arrangement with Luciano. She had fought to drive the mob out of Harlem entirely. She saw Johnson's negotiation as a capitulation. Their relationship did not survive the rupture. St. Clair passed her organization to Johnson, not willingly but out of necessity, and largely withdrew from public life. She married Sufi Abdul Hamid, a controversial black religious and labor leader. She later shot him after suspecting an affair, was convicted of assault, and was imprisoned again. After her release in the early 1940s, she lived quietly, investing in real estate and continuing to advocate for civil rights through her newspaper columns. She died in December 1969, shortly before her 73rd birthday. Still wealthy, but largely forgotten by the broader public. The community, however, remembered her, and the effects of what she had done, what she and Johnson had done together, were permanent. The fall of the corrupt officials was not a symbolic victory, it was a structural one. The police lieutenant and the 13 officers suspended as a result of St. Clair's testimony were not merely embarrassed. They were removed from positions that had allowed them to function as instruments of the mob's control over Harlem. The resignation of Mayor Walker was not merely a scandal. It ended an administration that had institutionalized the sale of public office and the protection of organized crime at the highest levels of city government. The election of LaGuardia was not merely a change of party. It marked the beginning of a genuine reform era in which the structures of corruption that had made Schultz's invasion of Harlem possible were systematically dismantled. None of this happened because of Bumpy Johnson alone or because of Stephanie St. Clair alone. It happened because of a convergence of pressures, legal, political, journalistic, and criminal, that produced a moment of systemic failure in the machinery of exploitation. But within that convergence, St. Clair's testimony was a specific and documented act that produced specific and documented consequences. And the man who stood behind her, who protected her, who had emerged from years of solitary confinement with the capacity to understand the system well enough to help dismantle part of it, that man was Bumpy Johnson. On the question of what happened inside those prison cells, what Bumpy Johnson thought about during those 3 years of isolation, will never be answered with certainty. He did not leave a diary. He did not give interviews about his inner life during that period. What survived were the poems he wrote, some of which were published in black literary reviews during the Harlem Renaissance. What survived was the testimony of people who knew him afterward, who observed the difference between the young man who went in and the older man who came out. What survived was the pattern of his subsequent behavior, the patience, the calculation, the willingness to wait for the right moment rather than striking at the wrong one. The writer Amiri Baraka, who met Johnson decades later, recalled that Bumpy spoke to him with a gravity and a strategic clarity that Baraka, then a young poet, could not fully grasp at the time. Johnson warned Baraka that he and his contemporaries were heading for trouble if they did not become fully conscious of the systems arrayed against them. Baraka did not understand then. He understood later. In 1992, he co-composed a bebop opera titled The Life and Life of Bumpy Johnson in homage to the old man. Baraka noted that Johnson, too, wrote passionate poetry with a hard, race-conscious edge. The legacy of those years in solitary confinement extended far beyond the fall of individual officials. It extended into the structure of Harlem itself. When Johnson negotiated his arrangement with Luciano, he created something that had not existed before, a space of black autonomy within the framework of organized crime in New York City. This was not a utopia. It was built on illegal gambling, on the drug trade, on violence and intimidation. The heroin that Johnson helped distribute through Harlem destroyed lives and families for generations. There is no moral case to be made for the enterprise itself, but within that enterprise there was a principle that the community recognized and valued, the principle that the decisions affecting Harlem would be made by someone who lived there, who understood its people, who answered to its rhythms. The numbers runners were local people. The money circulated locally. The authority was local. In a city and a country that systematically denied black communities the right to control their own economic and political lives, even this flawed, criminal version of self-governance meant something. Johnson maintained this position for more than 3 decades. He was arrested more than 40 times. He served a second major prison term at Alcatraz from 1952 to 1963 on drug conspiracy charges. He was under federal indictment for a third drug conspiracy when he died on July 7, 1968. Collapsing at Wells Restaurant in Harlem at 2 o'clock in the morning, shortly after a waitress set before him a plate of chicken, hominy grits, and a cup of coffee. His childhood friend Finley Hoskins was at the table. Someone ran to the Rhythm Club to fetch Junie Bird, another friend from his youth in Charleston. Bird cradled the dying man in his arms. Johnson opened his eyes briefly, smiled, and lost consciousness. He was taken to Harlem Hospital, where he was pronounced dead of congestive heart failure at the age of 62. In December 1965, 3 years before his death, Johnson had staged a sit-down protest inside a Harlem police station, refusing to leave as a protest against the relentless surveillance of him and, by extension, of the black community. He was arrested and charged with refusal to leave a police station. A judge acquitted him. The act was a deliberate echo of the methods that the civil rights movement had made famous across the South. The sit-in, the refusal to comply, the use of one's own body as a statement of defiance against unjust authority. But it was also an echo of something older and more personal, the defiance that had landed him in solitary confinement decades earlier, now refined, redirected, and wielded with the precision of a man who understood that the most powerful form of resistance is the one that forces the system to expose its own nature. Stephanie St. Clair died in 1969, 1 year after Bumpy, in near total obscurity. The Seabury Commission's records are preserved in archives. The names of the officers who were suspended, the judges who were dismissed, the mayor who resigned. These are matters of public record, documented in newspapers, court filings, and government reports. The connection between a black woman's testimony and the fall of Tammany Hall is established historical fact. And the connection between a young man's transformation in solitary confinement and his emergence as the strategic partner of that woman is supported by the weight of biographical evidence, though the interior journey, the specific thoughts, the specific moments of realization, belongs to a history that no archive can contain. What remains is the trajectory. A boy arrives in Harlem from Charleston, South Carolina, carrying nothing but a temper and a bump on the back of his head. He fights. He steals. He is imprisoned. He is placed in a cell alone, and the door closes, and the world goes quiet. In that silence, he reads, he writes, he thinks. He emerges a different man, still dangerous, still willing to fight, but now capable of seeing the larger architecture of the forces that imprison people like him, not just in cells, but in poverty and in exploitation, in the systematic denial of legitimate opportunity. He joins a woman who has been fighting those forces alone. Together, they mount a resistance that is partly violent, partly legal, and partly political. The legal component, her testimony before the Seabury Commission, produces consequences that ripple outward through the entire structure of city government, toppling officers, judges, a sheriff, and a mayor. The man watches, he learns, he waits, and when the moment comes, he negotiates an arrangement that preserves, for 3 decades, a measure of autonomy for the community he claims as his own. It is not a clean story. It is not a story of a hero in any uncomplicated sense. It is the story of a man who was placed in a box and emerged with the capacity to think outside of it, who used that capacity in the service of a criminal enterprise that did real harm to real people, who also used it in the service of a community that had no other champion willing to stand at its center and refuse to be moved. The officials who fell, the lieutenant, the officers, the judges, the mayor, did not fall because of Bumpy Johnson alone. They fell because the system they had built was rotten, and because enough pressure, applied at enough points, eventually caused the rot to become visible. But one of those points of pressure was a woman's testimony, and behind that woman stood a man who had learned, in a solitary cell, that patience and intelligence are weapons more powerful than any gun. The lesson of solitary confinement, as Bumpy Johnson appears to have understood it, was not that suffering makes you strong, as suffering frequently destroys. The lesson was that silence, if you can survive it, gives you something that noise cannot, the space to see the system as it actually is, to map its connections, to identify its weaknesses, to wait until the moment when a single well-placed act, a testimony, a negotiation, a refusal to leave a police station, can change the equation. That is the plan that Bumpy Johnson carried out of solitary confinement. Not a battle plan, a vision, an understanding of how power works and where it breaks. Harlem remembered. The old-timers who knew him told the story not as a tale of crime, but as a tale of transformation. A man went into a cell as nothing, broke, violent, purposeless, and came out as something else. What he became was complicated. What he built was flawed. But what he destroyed, or helped destroy, was a system of corruption that had preyed on his community for years. The cell did not make him good, it made him capable. And in a world that had decided he was nothing, capability was its own kind of revolution. The police station on which he staged his protest still stands in Harlem, though its function has changed over the years. Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx, where he is buried, receives visitors who come to pay respects to a man whose name still carries weight in the neighborhood he governed. The state lottery, legal, government-operated, generating billions in revenue, functions on essentially the same principle as the numbers game that Stephanie St. Clair pioneered and that Bumpy Johnson inherited. The profits now go to the state rather than to the community. Whether this represents progress is a question that the old-timers of Harlem, those few who remain, would answer with a silence more eloquent than any speech. The cell was small, the silence was long, and when it ended, the man who walked out carried something that the system had not intended to give him. He carried a plan, not a plan written on paper, not a plan shared with conspirators in whispered meetings, but a plan embedded in his understanding of the world, an understanding forged in years of enforced stillness, in the reading of books that opened doors the prison could not lock, in the writing of poems that proved his mind had not been broken. The plan was simple in its essence, though its execution would take decades. See the system, find the people who are fighting it, stand with them, protect them, learn from them. Wait. And when the system shows its weakness, do not waste the moment. Bumpy Johnson did not waste his moments. The corrupt officials fell. Harlem endured. And the story is still told quietly by those who understand that the most dangerous thing you can do to a man in a cell is leave him alone with his thoughts.